Hi, I'm Marley Leonard, a graduate student at Concordia University, Wisconsin, in the Nurse Practitioner program, and I'm going to discuss the importance of the American Healthcare Reform Act and mental health. Some of the main points in this are understanding who will lose coverage, why they will lose coverage, and why they want this bill to be passed. H.R. 277 is the American Healthcare Reform Act. The biggest part of this is that it's going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which was passed by Barack Obama in March of 2010. The Affordable Care Act is critical in improving access and coverage for those with mental health and those receiving mental health care. Also part of this bill is tax reform, but we're not going to cover much of the tax reform portion. I'm mainly going to cover those parts that apply to mental health. These are just some basic statistics about mental health in the U.S. Some of the big ones included are that 1 in 5 adults in America experience mental illness, and that's about 43.8 million adults experiencing mental illness in a given year. Nearly 1 in 25, about 10 million adults in America, live with a serious mental illness. Also, about 10.2 million Americans, which are adults, have co-occurring mental health and addiction disorders. Many of these people are covered under Medicaid, which is one of the big points with the Affordable Care Act and this American Healthcare Reform Act. So part of the problem is, passed with the Affordable Care Act was mental health parity, which is that insurance providers must provide equality in services for mental and physical health. That being said, that means that the limits for medical illness and the limits for mental health cannot vary. The limits for mental health cannot be any less than they are for physical health. Also, the Affordable Care Act required mental health and substance abuse treatment. That's through private insurance as well as state-subsidized Medicaid plans. There has to be some form of mental health and substance abuse treatment allowed under any of those plans. Again, the big part is that this would be repealed under passing of the American Healthcare Reform Act, which repeals the Affordable Care Act. It also will eliminate the Medicaid expansion that was put in place with the Affordable Care Act. Some of the unintended consequences of this are, in total, that 24 million Americans will lose Medicaid coverage. That will be up to 21 million in 2020 and then 24 million in 2026. Now, there are about 16.4 million more people covered under Medicaid since 2013, with a total of about 63 million Americans that are covered under Medicaid. Again, those losing coverage is due to eliminating the expansion of the Medicaid coverage eligibility. This bill will also allow state health plans to drop coverage of mental health and substance abuse treatment. They will be able to charge higher premiums for pre-existing conditions such as depression and/or anxiety. It also creates high-risk pools, which cost more money and provides less coverage. Some more of the unintended consequences are mainly statistics. Again, it increases the amount of uninsured, which leads to a decrease in access to mental health care. Serious mental illness in America costs about $193.2 billion in lost earnings per year. Individuals living with serious mental illness face an increased risk of having chronic medical conditions in addition to their mental illness. And adults in the U.S. living with serious mental illness die on average about 25 years earlier than others. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., and about 18 to 22 veterans die each day by suicide. Again, these statistics show the staggering amount of care needed through mental health coverage. So the fiscal estimate was a little difficult on this because the big part of the American Health Care Reform Act is to reduce the federal deficit. I couldn't necessarily find any costs related to passing the American Health Care Reform Act. The biggest thing was reducing the federal deficit by $337 billion from 2017 to 2026. Some stakeholders in this include NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the World Health Organization, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then the next three, they all have spoken out against the American Health Care Reform Act. The American Medical Association states that the proposed legislation will limit Americans' access to affordable health insurance or maintaining coverage under the Medicare program. The American Nurses Association criticized the bill for eliminating the Prevention and Public Health Fund. This jeopardizes the health of Americans with pre-existing conditions and restructuring the Medicaid program so as to restrict access to health care. And then the American Psychiatric Association stated that it will reduce mental health and substance use coverage for millions of Americans enrolled in Medicaid and contribute to the loss of coverage for millions more individuals. My recommendation for this is some of the biggest thing would be education. Educating on the American Health Care Reform Act and mental health. I think it's important for all those involved in healthcare or those that would even be voting to be educated well on these topics. Mental health is such a wide range of care, and it's important to understand that eliminating coverage is ultimately going to force those with mental illness to seek care through emergency rooms. Emergency rooms aren't necessarily the right place for people with mental illness to go. As well as it's important to contact those in public office, such as representatives and senators that would be voting on the American Health Care Reform Act. And my recommendation is to vote against the American Health Care Reform Act to help maintain coverage for those that do have mental illness. These are the references that were used during the PowerPoint. I appreciate your time and thank you for listening.